The day my son-in-law told me to grab your junk and get out, he was standing in the center of a marble foyer I had personally designed. He looked powerful there, tall, smug, his arms slung possessively around my daughter's shoulders as if the house, the air, even the blood in her veins belonged to him. He had that grin predators get when they think the cage door is locked and the prey is cornered. "Take your old boxes and leave," he snarled. "This isn't your place anymore." My daughter stood beside him, silent, pale, avoiding my eyes. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I simply looked at him the way a banker looks at an unpaid loan, because 3 things were true. First, he was cheating on my daughter. Second, he believed the mansion was his. Third, he had absolutely no idea whose name was on every single legal document. I had built that mansion 22 years earlier, brick by brick, after my husband died. I turned grief into steel, steel into business, business into wealth. It wasn't inherited money. It wasn't luck. It was 18-hour days, contracts negotiated in hospital waiting rooms, and learning to survive in rooms full of men who underestimated me. When my daughter fell in love with him, I tried to be supportive. He was charming then, attentive, polished. He spoke about ambition and expansion and family legacy. I heard hunger in his voice, but I mistook it for drive. That was my mistake. After their wedding, he began suggesting renovations, expansions, upgrades. He talked my daughter into convincing me to let them move into the mansion, temporarily, while their new investment project matured. I agreed, under one condition. The house remained solely in my name. He laughed at the time. "Of course, Mom," he said smoothly. "It's your masterpiece." He thought paperwork was just paper. 3 years later, I received the first whisper of truth. A photo sent anonymously. Him at a resort, not alone. Then hotel receipts accidentally mailed to the house. Late-night business trips that lined up perfectly with social media posts from a woman who tagged locations too carelessly. I didn't confront him. I investigated. Quietly. Lawyers, financial audits, background checks. What I found wasn't just infidelity, it was debt. Massive, reckless, arrogant debt. He had leveraged future deals that never closed. Promised investors returns that didn't exist. And worst of all, he had quietly attempted to position the mansion as collateral in conversations, property he did not own. When I confronted my daughter gently, she broke down. She knew about one affair. She didn't know about the others. She didn't know about the debt. She didn't know he had been preparing to convince her to pressure me into transferring the deed. That was the night she defended him anyway. "You don't understand him," she whispered. "He's under pressure. Pressure does not unzip another woman's dress. Pressure does not gamble away stability. But love makes intelligent women blind." The explosion came a week later. He must have sensed my shift in energy. Predators feel when the prey stops trembling. He cornered me in the foyer that afternoon. My daughter was there, fragile and anxious. He accused me of interfering, of poisoning her mind, of trying to control their lives. Then he said it. "Grab your junk and get out. We're done with your manipulation." In my own house, I looked at my daughter one last time. She didn't speak, so I left. I took only my purse. I moved into a penthouse apartment I owned downtown, another asset he had forgotten about. I waited. 3 days later, the first notice arrived at the mansion. Formal, legal, precise. 30 days to vacate. He called immediately, furious. "You can't evict us!" I replied calmly. "I own every inch of that property." Silence. Then laughter. "She wouldn't let you?" "She doesn't own it," I said softly. "I do." That was when the ground shifted under his feet. He scrambled. He tried charm, apologies, claimed it was a misunderstanding, claimed stress made him lash out. He even sent flowers. I sent a certified letter in return. Eviction confirmed. Then the second wave hit him. His investors began pulling out. Someone, anonymously, had shared documentation of his unstable financial positioning. His reputation began cracking. Without the illusion of wealth the mansion provided, he looked smaller, desperate. My daughter came to see me 2 weeks later. Her eyes were swollen from crying. "He says if we lose the house, everything collapses." I poured her tea. "Everything built on lies deserves to collapse." She asked if I would reconsider, for her, for the grandchildren she hoped to have one day. I asked her one question. If he had succeeded in putting this house in his name, where would I be right now? She didn't answer. 30 days passed. Sheriffs arrived. They packed designer furniture purchased on credit. They cataloged art I had collected over decades. He tried to delay the process, but But the law is not moved by tantrums. They left with suitcases. The mansion stood empty again. For 3 months, I heard nothing. Then the call came. Not from him. From her. Her voice was hollow. They were renting a small apartment now. Investors had filed civil suits. One affair had turned into 3 confirmed betrayals. The woman from the resort had exposed messages publicly after he refused to leave my daughter for her. His empire, built on borrowed shine, had imploded. "Mom," she whispered, "we made a mistake. I agreed to meet them. Not at the mansion. At my office." He walked in first. No tailored suit, no predator's grin. Just a man who finally understood gravity. He couldn't meet my eyes. Then he did something I will never forget. He begged. Actually begged. Said he had been arrogant. Said he underestimated me. Said he thought I would never act against my own daughter's marriage. I folded my hands on the desk. "You told me to grab my junk," I reminded him calmly. He flinched. "I built that house before you learned how to spell equity," I continued. "You mistook kindness for weakness, support for control, silence for ignorance." My daughter cried quietly beside him. He asked if they could return. Just temporarily. Until they stabilized. He promised counseling, transparency, change. I looked at my daughter, not him. "Do you want to stay married to a man who tried to discard your mother to gain property?" I asked her gently. Silence. Long, painful silence. That was the moment she finally saw him without the fog. She straightened her back. "No," she said. He turned toward her in shock. "What are you doing?" "Choosing," she replied. "The divorce took 6 months. I paid for the best attorney for her, not him. The debt he accumulated followed him like a shadow. The investors showed no mercy. As for the mansion, I renovated it, not because it needed upgrades, but because I wanted to erase the memory of his voice echoing in that foyer. My daughter moved back, not as a dependent, but as a partner in my company. I taught her what contracts really mean, what leverage looks like, how to read balance sheets and human behavior. 3 months after they begged me back, the mansion felt like mine again. Peaceful, strong, unshaken. Sometimes I stand in the foyer where he once told me to leave. Sunlight spills across the marble the same way it did that afternoon. But now there's no predator standing there, only a woman who remembers exactly who she is. He thought ownership was about confidence. He learned too late that ownership is about documentation. And I owned every inch. The moment he told me to grab your junk and get out, something inside the room shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but like the silent crack that runs through glass before it shatters. He stood in the center of the foyer, beneath the chandelier I had imported from Italy 20 years earlier. Sunlight poured through the tall arched windows and hit the marble floors in sheets of gold. That house had always felt warm to me, alive with memory, birthday parties, anniversaries, the echo of my daughter's laughter as a child. But in that moment, it felt cold. Not because of the architecture. Because of him. He didn't just speak the words, he spat them. "Grab your junk and get out. This isn't your place anymore." There was something almost theatrical about his posture. One hand tucked into the pocket of his tailored trousers, the other draped around my daughter's shoulders like he was claiming territory. His jaw was tight, eyes hard, lips curved in that thin smile that isn't amusement, it's dominance. He thought he was delivering a final blow. He thought I would crumble. Disrespect is rarely sudden. It builds in layers. Looking back, I can see the progression. The subtle eye rolls when I offered advice. The way he began referring to the mansion as "or house" in conversations with guests. The casual dismissal in his tone whenever I reminded him about property taxes or maintenance schedules. Each slight was small enough to ignore individually, but together they formed a pattern, a quiet rewriting of reality where I slowly became a guest in my own home. But that day was different. That day, the mask slipped completely. The argument had started over something trivial. I had questioned one of his investment ventures. After noticing irregularities in the paperwork he left on the dining table, numbers that didn't align, figures that were inflated, I asked calmly, not accusingly. I have run businesses longer than he's been shaving. I know when math doesn't make sense. Instead of answering, he deflected. Instead of explaining, he attacked. "You don't trust me," he snapped. "I trust documentation." I replied evenly. That's when his temper ignited. His voice grew louder, echoing off the high ceilings. My daughter stood beside him, anxious, wringing her hands. She looked torn, between the man she married and the woman who raised her. "You're always interfering," he said. You think just because you built this place, you can control everything. Built this place. The irony was almost laughable. I didn't inherit that house. I didn't marry into it. I built it after burying my husband with barely enough savings to cover the funeral. I remember signing construction contracts with trembling hands, studying blueprints late at night, after putting my daughter to sleep, negotiating with contractors who assumed I didn't understand structural costs. That mansion was not just property. It was proof that I could survive devastation and still create something magnificent. Yet there he was, standing on floors my sacrifice had paid for, telling me I didn't belong. Maybe it's time you let us live our own lives, he continued, voice rising. Without you hovering, without you acting like this is still yours. Still yours. I looked at him carefully then, really looked at him. His anger wasn't just about independence. It was about control. He wanted the final symbol of power, ownership. Without it, he was just a man living under another person's roof. With it, he could rewrite the hierarchy. And that's when he delivered the line he must have rehearsed in his head. Grab your junk and get out. The words were crude, deliberately degrading. Not please leave, not we need space. He chose language meant to shrink me, to reduce decades of effort into junk, to make me feel temporary. I noticed something fascinating in that moment. He expected a reaction. He expected outrage, tears, a shouting match he could twist into proof that I was unstable or controlling. His eyes were almost eager, like he was waiting for the explosion. But power does not always roar. Sometimes it goes silent. I felt my heartbeat steady instead of race. A calm settled over me, not because I wasn't hurt, but because clarity had arrived. The illusion was gone. The polite son-in-law mask had fallen completely, revealing ambition stripped of gratitude. My daughter whispered, "Please, both of you, stop." But she didn't defend me. That hurt more than his words. Still, I refused to beg for respect in a house legally bound to my name. I glanced around the foyer at the staircase I had chosen, the artwork I had collected, the walls that had witnessed my entire adult life. Then I looked back at him. "You're asking me to leave my own property," I said calmly. He laughed, actually laughed. "Your property. Don't be dramatic, we live here now. This is our home." There it was. The delusion had solidified into belief. He genuinely thought presence equaled possession. That occupying space rewrote ownership. That confidence could override contracts. He had grown comfortable. Too comfortable. The luxury lifestyle, the address that impressed his business partners, the image of success the mansion projected, it had all fed his ego. And ego, when overfed, begins to believe it deserves the feast. "Take your boxes," he repeated, pointing toward the hallway. "I'm done being undermined in my own house." His own house. The audacity might have been amusing under different circumstances. Instead of arguing, I did something that unsettled him more than any scream could have. I nodded, not in submission. In acknowledgement. "Very well," I said quietly. Confusion flickered across his face. He wasn't prepared for compliance, he wanted combat. I walked past him slowly, not hurried, not flustered. I didn't gather boxes. I didn't touch a single object. I simply picked up my purse from the console table. At the doorway, I paused and turned. The chandelier light framed them both, my daughter anxious, him rigid with forced confidence. "I will leave," I said. "But remember this moment." He smirked. "Trust me, I will." Oh, he would. As I stepped outside, the air felt different, fresher. Almost electric. I wasn't being cast out. I was repositioning. Disrespect, when it reveals itself fully, becomes a gift. It shows you exactly who someone is when they believe they hold power. He thought telling me to grab my junk was the end of the confrontation. He didn't realize it was the beginning of his education, because ownership isn't decided in a foyer during a tantrum. It's decided in documents filed quietly, years earlier, by someone who never confused generosity with surrender. And as I drove away that afternoon, I didn't feel defeated. I felt patient. Betrayal rarely arrives all at once. It slips in quietly, disguised as coincidence, stress, or misunderstanding. If someone had asked me in the early years of their marriage whether my son-in-law was capable of deception, I might have hesitated before answering. He was polished, attentive, and always ready with a confident explanation. But deception does not always look like villainy. Sometimes it looks like ambition wrapped in charm. The first crack appeared in the smallest way, a photograph sent from an anonymous account. No message, no accusation, Just an image of him at a beachfront resort, sunglasses on, drink in hand, seated far too close to a woman who was not my daughter. The caption was cropped out, but the intimacy was not. It could have been dismissed as business networking, if not for the way her hand rested on his knee. I didn't forward it. I didn't confront him. I didn't even show my daughter. Instead, I waited. Within weeks, small irregularities began surfacing like debris after a storm. A hotel receipt mailed accidentally to the mansion instead of his office. A charge for a weekend spa package in a city he claimed he had only passed through for meetings. Late night calls taken in hushed tones on the balcony, followed by long showers as if water could wash away guilt. My daughter noticed the distance but explained it away. He's under pressure, she told me. Big investors, big deals. Pressure has become the universal excuse for poor character. Still, I said nothing. I watched. The second anonymous message arrived a month later. This time it included screenshots, messages between him and the same woman from the resort. They were not subtle. They were not ambiguous. They were explicit enough to remove doubt completely. What struck me wasn't just the infidelity. It was the carelessness. Men who fear consequences are discreet. Men who believe themselves untouchable grow sloppy. That was when I began to dig deeper. If he could lie so confidently in his marriage, what else was he lying about? I hired a private investigator, quietly, professionally. No drama. Within weeks, a pattern emerged that was far more alarming than an affair. There wasn't just one woman. There were at least 3. Different cities, different excuses, business summits, networking retreats, investment conferences. The man who claimed exhaustion at family dinners had energy for midnight cocktails and hotel suites. But infidelity, painful as it is, was only the surface wound. The deeper infection was financial. The investigator connected me with a forensic accountant, someone experienced in untangling complicated portfolios. What we uncovered turned my concern into something colder. He was drowning in debt. Not ordinary debt, not strategic business leverage. Reckless, inflated, desperate borrowing disguised as expansion. He had pitched ambitious development projects to investors, luxury condos, tech startups, international trade ventures, none of which had secured stable funding. He relied heavily on projected valuations rather than actual assets. His presentations were immaculate, his confidence persuasive, but behind the polished slides were fragile numbers built on assumptions instead of guarantees. Worse still, he had begun implying to potential backers that he had access to substantial property collateral. The mansion. My mansion. He never outright claimed ownership. That would have been illegal. But he spoke in suggestive language. Our estate, or property holdings. Significant real estate backing. Investors heard what they wanted to hear. Stability, security, wealth. They didn't know the deed bore only one name. Mine. I felt something shift inside me then. Not heartbreak, but clarity. This wasn't just a man straying from vows. This was a man constructing illusions and using proximity to wealth as scaffolding. When I finally chose to speak to my daughter, I approached gently. I showed her evidence, first of the affair, then of the financial instability. I expected shock, tears, anger. I did not expect defense. He's made mistakes, she whispered. But he loves me. Love does not require secrecy. He's just trying to build something big, she continued. Sometimes risks are necessary. Risk is calculated. This was gambling. I showed her projections, outstanding loans, interest rates that would suffocate even a seasoned investor, credit lines extended far beyond sustainable margins. If one investor pulled out, the entire structure would wobble. If 2 did, it would collapse. Her hands trembled as she read. "Does he know you know?" she asked. "No," I replied. She closed her eyes. For a moment I thought she would confront him that night. Instead, she chose silence. Fear often disguises itself as loyalty. She was afraid that if she exposed him, the marriage would fracture. She believed she could help him stabilize, that love could substitute for liquidity. What she didn't understand was that he had already calculated his next move. Over the following weeks, I noticed subtle shifts in his behavior toward me. He became overly agreeable during dinners. He complimented my business acumen more than usual. He asked casual questions about estate planning, about long-term asset transfers, about whether I had considered simplifying property ownership for tax efficiency. It was almost impressive. He was laying groundwork. At one dinner, he mentioned how complicated it must be for me to manage such a large property at my age. He suggested that transferring the mansion into a joint family trust could protect it from future legal vulnerabilities. I smiled politely. Legal vulnerabilities. The irony nearly made me laugh. He was preparing to use my daughter as leverage. I saw it in the way he would glance at her when discussing property matters. The unspoken request. Convince her. Pressure her. Frame it as security for grandchildren not yet born. That was when betrayal stopped being personal and became strategic. He wasn't just cheating on my daughter. He was preparing to secure a financial lifeline using her emotional attachment and my generosity as tools. I realized then that confronting him directly would only make him defensive and cautious. Predators retreat when they sense exposure. I needed him comfortable, overconfident, so I pretended ignorance. I continued inviting them to events, continued discussing neutral topics, continued acting as though his business bravado impressed me. Meanwhile, I fortified everything legally. Updated wills, reconfirmed property protections, established irrevocable clauses. If he thought proximity to wealth equaled access, he was gravely mistaken. The final piece of confirmation came unexpectedly. One of the women he was involved with contacted me directly. Not out of compassion, out of spite. He had promised her divorce, promised shared wealth, promised a future in the mansion. When she realized he was stalling, she lashed out. Her messages included voice recordings. In one, he laughed while describing how old money gets transferred eventually. Old money. I had built every cent. That recording erased the last thread of hesitation inside me. This wasn't stress. This wasn't temporary weakness. This was character. He believed time entitled him to what he had not earned. He believed marriage was a shortcut to ownership. He believed charm could substitute for legitimacy. Hidden betrayal is dangerous not because of secrecy alone, but because of entitlement woven into it. He didn't feel guilty. He felt justified. And that made him far more dangerous than a man who simply strays. By the time he finally exploded in the foyer weeks later, telling me to leave, I already knew everything. The affairs, the debt, the manipulation. The illusion of empire built on borrowed shine. He thought that moment was spontaneous anger. He had no idea it was the climax of a story I had already finished reading. And unlike him, I never gamble with assets I cannot afford to lose. Silence can be sharper than confrontation. When I first realized the depth of my son-in-law's deception, every instinct in me wanted to expose him immediately, to lay the evidence on the dining table, to demand explanations, to force accountability. But emotion is expensive, and I have never built anything substantial by spending recklessly. So instead of reacting, I prepared. The first call I made was not to my daughter, and certainly not to him. It was to my attorney, a woman who has handled corporate disputes worth more than most people's lifetime earnings. She understands two things intimately: paper and power. I asked her a simple question. If someone living in my property believes they have leverage over it, what protections do I need reinforced? There was a pause on the other end before she answered carefully, as someone testing boundaries. Not yet, I said, but they will. Within a week, we began reviewing every document connected to the mansion. The original deed, the construction contracts from decades ago, property tax filings, insurance policies, utility accounts. Every signature was examined, every clause reread. I wanted no gray areas, no loopholes, no technicality that could be twisted into opportunity. Ownership is not just about whose name appears on paper. It's about whether that paper can withstand pressure. I discovered something that both relieved and disturbed me. The legal structure I had put in place years ago, mostly for estate planning, was ironclad. The mansion was solely in my name, protected by a trust that prevented automatic spousal claims through marriage. It could not be transferred without my direct authorization and notarized consent. There were no co-signers, no shared titles, no ambiguity. Legally, he had nothing. But law alone is not enough when manipulation is involved. I had seen enough family disputes over inheritance to know that emotional leverage can be as dangerous as forged signatures. If he convinced my daughter to pressure me publicly, to frame me as controlling or unstable, the narrative could complicate matters socially, even if not legally. So I widened the circle. A forensic accountant was brought in quietly to examine any indirect financial exposure. Had I ever co-signed a loan for them? No. Had I guaranteed any of his ventures using personal credit? Never. Had there been any attempt to list the property as an asset in investor proposals? That required investigation. The findings were unsettling. While he had not legally pledged the mansion, he had referenced family-owned real estate holdings, in multiple investor presentations. The wording was careful, technically true in the broadest sense, but intentionally misleading. He allowed potential backers to assume access without confirming ownership. It was a calculated illusion. I asked the accountant, if his ventures collapse, could creditors attempt to pursue claims against my property? Not successfully, she said. But they might try to intimidate. Intimidation does not frighten me. Still, I prepared. My attorney drafted a formal notice clarifying that the mansion was not affiliated with any of his business entities. Copies were stored, ready to be distributed if necessary. I updated my will to include explicit exclusions preventing marital claims through my daughter's relationship. It felt harsh, but clarity is kinder than chaos. Meanwhile, I maintained a calm exterior. At family dinners, I asked him about his projects as though nothing were amiss. I listened as he described expansion plans, international partners, upcoming breakthroughs. His confidence was theatrical. He believed momentum protected him. What he didn't realize was that I had already seen the balance sheets. The deeper I looked into his finances, the more unstable the structure appeared. Loans stacked upon loans. Short-term borrowing used to cover long-term obligations. Investor money redirected to sustain appearances. Luxury expenditures maintained to project success. And always, the mansion in the background of his photographs. The sweeping staircase visible during video calls. The manicured gardens hosting networking events. The house had become his stage prop. I decided then that if he ever attempted to push me out, I would not argue. I would act. Preparation is not loud. It is meticulous. I installed updated security systems under the guise of modernization. Access codes were changed discreetly. Administrative control remained solely with me. Property management accounts were reviewed and secured. If eviction became necessary, I wanted no operational obstacles. At the same time, I gathered documentation of his infidelity and financial misrepresentation, not for revenge, but for leverage if he attempted to distort the truth. Evidence is insurance. The hardest part was watching my daughter remain in partial denial. She sensed tension but avoided specifics. When I gently encouraged her to review certain financial realities, she grew defensive. "You don't trust him," she accused softly. "Trust is earned through transparency." I could have forced her to see everything immediately. Instead, I chose restraint. If I exposed him too abruptly, she might cling to him out of fear. People often defend what threatens to collapse because collapse feels like personal failure. So I waited for him to overplay his hand. It didn't take long. His behavior toward me shifted subtly once he sensed that I was no longer easily influenced. He became more assertive, less deferential. Small remarks about eventual transitions and generational shifts slipped into conversation. He tested language, gauging reaction. I gave him none. The day he finally erupted in the foyer, telling me to leave, I was not surprised. In fact, I had anticipated a confrontation. His debt pressure was increasing. Investors were demanding updates. One of his affairs was unraveling. He needed control somewhere. He chose the house. When he said, "This isn't your place anymore," I almost admired the boldness of the lie. It takes remarkable audacity to attempt to rewrite legal reality through volume alone. But volume does not override documentation. As he pointed toward the hallway and repeated, "Grab your junk," I felt an unusual calm. Not because his words didn't hurt, but because I knew something he didn't. Every inch of that property was legally fortified. Every pathway he might attempt had already been blocked. Every narrative he could spin had documented counterproof. He believed confrontation was power. He had no idea preparation was stronger. When I walked out that afternoon with only my purse, it was not surrender. It was strategy. By leaving peacefully, I removed his ability to paint me as combative. By not arguing ownership in that heated moment, I allowed him to remain comfortable in his misconception just long enough for formal action to feel like gravity rather than retaliation. That night, from my penthouse apartment, another asset he had overlooked, I instructed my attorney to proceed. The eviction notice was drafted with precision. No emotional language, no accusation, just facts. Property owner me. Occupant's temporary residence without ownership interest. 30 days to vacate. As I reviewed the document before it was sent, I felt something deeper than anger. I felt vindicated. Not because he would be embarrassed, but because he would learn a lesson he should have understood long ago. Generosity does not erase ownership, and silence does not equal ignorance. The silent investigation had given me something more valuable than revenge. It had given me certainty, and certainty makes action effortless. The eviction notice was delivered on a Tuesday morning at exactly 9:14 a.m. I know the time because my attorney called me the moment it was confirmed. There was no dramatic music, no raised voices, no cinematic confrontation. Just a legal courier handing over a thick envelope to a man who had spent months believing he was untouchable. Precision is powerful. The document itself was clinical. No emotional language, no references to betrayal. Just facts printed in sharp black ink. I was the sole legal owner of the property. The occupants were residing there at my discretion. That discretion had been revoked. They had 30 days to vacate. When he called me, his voice was unrecognizable. "What is this?" he demanded. "It's an eviction notice," I replied calmly. "You can't be serious." "I am always serious when I sign documents." There was a long pause, the kind that only happens when someone realizes the ground beneath them is not as solid as they assumed. I could almost hear his mind racing, flipping through memories, searching for a moment where I had transferred ownership, co-signed something, or verbally agreed to shared rights. He found nothing. "This is our home," he insisted. "It is my property," I corrected. The distinction mattered. He tried intimidation next. "You'll destroy your daughter's marriage over pride." "No," I said evenly. "You did that." Silence again. Then a shift in tone, softer, calculating. "We can talk about this. There's no need for legal drama." Legal drama. As if I had staged something theatrical instead of enforcing ownership. "I prefer clarity," I told him. The following days revealed more about his character than any investigation ever could. At first, he treated the notice as a bluff. He told my daughter I was trying to scare them. He claimed no judge would side against a married couple. He believed emotional optics would outweigh legal documentation. He underestimated two things: the law and my resolve. When his attorney contacted mine, the response was swift. Copies of the deed, trust documentation, tax records spanning decades. There was no ambiguity to exploit. No shared equity, no informal agreement. He had built his confidence on assumption, not paperwork. That confidence began to crack publicly. Investors talk, business circles whisper. When word spread that he was being formally evicted from the very mansion he implied he had backing from, questions followed. Subtle at first, then sharper. "As the property not yours? I thought your real estate portfolio was stronger." Reputation is fragile when built on image. Inside the house, tension grew heavy. My daughter called me twice during the first week, her voice strained. He was angry, not remorseful, not reflective angry. He blamed me for humiliating him, for sabotaging his credibility, for escalating what he framed as a family disagreement. It was never a disagreement. It was ownership versus entitlement. On day 12, he attempted a different tactic. He sent flowers to my office. A grand arrangement of white lilies, my favorite. Attached was a note: "Let's resolve this privately. We're family. Family does not attempt to erase you from your own home." I did not respond. By the second week, reality began closing in. One of his investors requested immediate financial disclosures. Another postponed funding pending clarification of asset representation inconsistencies. The eviction had exposed a vulnerability he had worked hard to conceal, that his empire leaned heavily on borrowed prestige. The mansion had been his backdrop of credibility. Without it, he looked smaller. On day 18, I received notice that he was attempting to file a temporary injunction to delay the eviction, citing marital residency rights. My attorney was almost amused. "He's grasping," she said. The injunction was denied within 48 hours. Residency does not override ownership when documentation is clear. The final 10 days were the most revealing. His anger turned to desperation. He accused my daughter of failing to defend him. He accused me of plotting from the beginning. He even suggested that I had orchestrated investor doubt deliberately. Projection is a powerful psychological shield, but facts dismantle it. On the 30th day, the sheriff arrived. I was not present, but I received updates. He argued briefly at the doorway, demanding more time. The deputies remained professional. The law is indifferent to wounded pride. Furniture was catalogued, personal belongings packed. Items purchased under my accounts remained. When he walked out carrying the last of his suitcases, he did not look like a man displaced. He looked like a man exposed. The mansion stood quiet that evening, empty, echoing slightly without their voices inside. I visited the next morning alone. The foyer felt different, not colder, not warmer, simply reclaimed. I stood where he had once told me to. "Grab your junk." The chandelier shimmered above. indifferent to the drama it had witnessed. Sunlight streamed across the marble floors exactly as it had that day. Power is not loud. It does not scream. It does not posture. It enforces. Over the next weeks, the external consequences intensified for him. Investors formally withdrew. Civil suits were filed alleging misrepresentation of assets. One affair surfaced publicly when a woman he had promised marriage decided to expose messages online. The illusion collapsed from multiple directions at once. He had believed the eviction would make me look cruel. Instead, it made him look unstable. The mansion's absence from his background photographs became symbolic. Clients who once admired his state meetings noticed he was now hosting discussions in rented office spaces. Image matters in high-level negotiations. Without the grandeur behind him, his confidence rang hollow. My daughter moved into a short-term apartment. She visited me often, quieter now, more reflective. She began to see patterns she had once ignored, the way he deflected accountability, the way he reframed mistakes as persecution, the way he equated possession with status. "You didn't destroy him," she said to me one evening. "No," I replied gently. "I removed something he was using to disguise himself." There is a difference. The eviction was never about revenge in the emotional sense. It was about boundaries, about refusing to allow entitlement to rewrite ownership, about demonstrating that kindness does not equal surrender. By the third month, the legal and financial pressure surrounding him had intensified to the point of collapse. Creditors circled. Partnerships dissolved. His calls became less arrogant, more strained. The mansion, meanwhile, underwent subtle renovation. Fresh paint, restored woodwork, a redesigned study, not because it needed improvement, but because reclaiming space sometimes requires symbolic renewal. When people later asked me how I had the strength to evict my own daughter and son-in-law, I answered simply, I did not evict my daughter. I evicted deception. The ruthless legal revenge was not fueled by rage. It was fueled by clarity, and clarity, when paired with documentation, is unstoppable. The collapse did not happen in a single dramatic moment. There was no thunderclap, no public scandal exploding overnight. Instead, it unfolded the way unstable structures always do, slowly at first, then all at once. The mansion had been more than a residence for him. It had been a symbol, a backdrop, a silent partner in every pitch he made. When investors walked through those tall doors and saw imported marble, curated art, manicured gardens stretching beyond glass walls, they didn't just see luxury, they saw legitimacy, stability, heritage. He had wrapped himself in that image like armor. Once the eviction stripped that armor away, the cracks in his empire became visible. The first investor to pull out did so quietly. A scheduled funding transfer was postponed pending review. Then another requested updated collateral documentation. The wording was polite, but the message was clear. They were reassessing risk. Risk had a new face now. Without the mansion behind him in video calls, he appeared diminished. Meetings that once took place in a grand study overlooking sculpted lawns were suddenly relocated to rented office spaces with generic decor. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Image fuels confidence. Confidence fuels persuasion. And his image had fractured. Whispers began circulating in business circles. Someone mentioned that he didn't actually own the estate he frequently referenced. Someone else hinted at inconsistencies in his asset disclosures. In high-level finance, doubt spreads faster than facts. Investors do not like uncertainty. One by one, they began requesting formal audits. That was when panic entered his voice. He called my daughter constantly, pacing their temporary apartment while flipping through spreadsheets and emails. He blamed market volatility. He blamed competitors. He blamed jealous interference. But deep down, he knew the truth: the illusion had been punctured. An empire built on projection cannot survive exposure. Then came the personal implosion. One of the women he had been involved with, the one from the resort photographs, discovered that he was not, in fact, preparing to leave his wife for her. She had believed his promises of shared wealth and future security in the family estate. When she realized that estate was no longer even accessible to him, anger replaced affection. She leaked messages, not to me this time, to social media. The screenshots were damning, not only romantic betrayal, but financial boasting. He had described himself as the primary decision-maker of a multi-million-dollar property. He had implied that inheritance transfers were inevitable. He had mocked those who underestimated his position. The posts gained traction quickly within certain circles. Not viral in the sensational sense, but visible enough to reach business associates. Now the collapse had both financial and reputational momentum. Investors who were already nervous saw confirmation of character flaws. Lawsuits followed. Civil claims alleging misrepresentation, accusations that projected assets had influenced funding decisions. Even if technically defensible, the cost of litigation alone was crushing. My daughter watched the unraveling from close proximity. At first, she tried to help him salvage things. She assisted with document organization. She made calls to reassure partners. She defended him in conversations where doubt was voiced. But every new revelation chipped away at her loyalty. She saw the messages from the other women, heard the recordings where he laughed about hold money transferring eventually, watched as he shifted blame onto everyone but himself. He told her I had orchestrated his downfall, that I had intentionally timed the eviction to sabotage his negotiations, that I had poisoned investor confidence behind the scenes. She came to me one evening, exhausted and hollow-eyed. "Did you contact any of his investors?" she asked quietly. "No," I said truthfully. "I enforced my boundary, nothing more." That was when something changed in her expression, because she realized something fundamental. If removing access to one property could destroy everything he built, then everything he built had been balanced on that property's illusion. He began sleeping less, snapping more. His confidence, once expansive and charismatic, narrowed into defensiveness. He stopped speaking about future projects and focused instead on immediate damage control. Creditors became less patient. When formal legal notices began arriving at their apartment, the tone shifted from corporate politeness to firm demand. Payment schedules, settlement offers, deadlines. He had always spoken about risk as if it were a badge of courage. Now risk had teeth. The final blow came from within his own network. A long-time associate publicly distanced himself, ceding irreconcilable differences in disclosure transparency. In the world they operated in, that phrasing was devastating. It was a professional way of saying, "I do not trust this man." Trust, once fractured publicly, rarely repairs fully. 3 months after the eviction, the man who once stood in my foyer declaring dominance was negotiating payment extensions with lenders. The tailored suits were worn less frequently. The luxury watch disappeared from his wrist, likely sold or leveraged. My daughter told me about the moment she knew it was over. They were sitting at a small kitchen table in the rented apartment. Papers spread everywhere. Legal notices stacked beside unopened mail. He was arguing on the phone with someone about repayment timelines. When he hung up, he slammed his hand against the table and muttered, "If your mother had just signed the transfer when we discussed it, none of this would be happening. Not if I had managed funds more responsibly. Not if I had been honest. If your mother had signed." That sentence shattered the last illusion she held, because it revealed the core truth. He believed my assets were the solution to his recklessness. He did not regret deception. He regretted losing access. The public and financial collapse was not caused by me. It was caused by exposure. When illusion is stripped away, reality stands naked, and reality does not negotiate with ego. Eventually, the lawsuits progressed. Settlements were discussed. Assets were liquidated. Projects were abandoned. His name, once spoken with admiration in certain business lounges, was now mentioned with caution. Meanwhile, the mansion stood untouched by the chaos, quiet, stable, legally secure. That contrast spoke louder than any revenge speech ever could. My daughter began therapy, not because she was weak, but because disentangling yourself from someone who builds reality on distortion requires strength. She started reviewing financial documents with clearer eyes. She began asking different questions. And slowly she stopped defending him. The collapse completed not with a bang, but with resignation. One evening, she called me and said, "He wants to meet. He says we need your help." Help. The word sounded different now. 3 months earlier, he had snarled at me to grab my junk and leave. Now, stripped of illusion, stripped of image, stripped of borrowed prestige, he was ready to beg. The public humiliation, the financial implosion, the exposure of affairs, none of it had been engineered theatrically. It was gravity, and gravity always wins against structures built on air.